Hello there. Welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chad Licciardello.
This week, 5 years on from the start of COVID, is America seeing the next pandemic emerging? We'll ask an expert.
And we're going to ask another expert about Trump's plan to deport thousands of migrants to Gitmo. But first,
Donald Trump built his political career on being prepared to attack rivals in ways that few, if any, have done before him. From his claim that Barack Obama was an illegitimate president born in Kenya and that John McCain wasn't a hero because he was held as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, to his racial attacks on Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. He has often shocked and outraged, and mostly, of course, he has gone on to win. His latest target is the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and the stakes this time are even higher than a single election. Trump was speaking yesterday at a conference organised by Saudi Arabia's sovereign investment fund, the Future Investment Initiative Institute. He gave an unflattering appraisal of Zelenskyy, painting him as little more than a con artist.
But think of it, a modestly successful comedian. President Zelenskyy talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that basically couldn't be won, that never had to start and never would have started if I was president, not even a chance. And it didn't start for 4 years, never would have started.
In his tirade, Trump claimed that Zelenskyy has low poll ratings in Ukraine, but for the record, in December last year, 52% of Ukrainians said they trusted Zelenskyy, although that was down 25 points in a year. Trump's approval rating this week, though, just 44%. Nevertheless, Ukraine was due to hold elections last year. Those were suspended under the provisions of martial law imposed following Russia's 2022 invasion. That delay is why Trump made this stunning claim, calling Zelenskyy
a dictator without elections. Zelenskyy better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast because that war is going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something I'll admit that only Trump is going to be able to do in the Trump administration. We're going to be able to do it.
Bragging aside, it was an unprecedented attack on an ally, calling them a dictator. And it came just one day after Trump falsely claimed that Ukraine started the war. Zelenskyy responded in as diplomatic a fashion as he could probably muster.
Unfortunately, President Trump, I have great respect for him as a leader of a nation that we have great respect for. The American people who always support us, unfortunately lives in this disinformation space.
Trump is now demanding that Zelenskyy call elections as a part of any peace process with Russia, giving Russia every opportunity to try and elect a more pro-Kremlin government in Kyiv. Trump's comments even drew some unusual Republican criticism back home, including a helpful fact check from Nebraska Representative Don Bacon, who wrote, "Putin started this war. Putin committed war crimes. Putin is the dictator who murdered his opponents. The EU nations have contributed more to Ukraine." Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune, meanwhile, who has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine, was asked what he thought of Trump's dictator comments.
The president speaks for himself. What I want to see is a peaceful result, a peaceful outcome. And I think right now there's a negotiation going on. And let's see where that ultimately leads. Hopefully it'll get to the outcome we all want to see.
So Senator Thune is basically saying that Trump doesn't speak for him, which is fine, except the American president literally speaks for America, including John Thune. Meanwhile, a press conference involving Zelenskyy and Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, was cancelled this morning. It was just turned into a photo op, no questions. This is all amid reports that Ukraine and the US are now again talking about ways to try and repay America's military assistance to Ukraine with more of Ukraine's mineral resources. But Chaz, fascinating that Keith Kellogg was not put in front of a microphone. Obviously, he was going to be asked, is this man standing next to you a dictator or not? Did he start the war or not? So I guess wisely the White House shut that down.
Yeah, I think they were worried about Keith Kellogg's answer, which would have been, no, he's not, but Putin is.
Right.
Because Keith Kellogg is no fan of Russia, which is why they're not just putting him in cotton wool, they're putting his mouth in cotton wool.
Yeah.
They don't like what he has to say.
And neither Zelenskyy nor Keith Kellogg were invited to the summit in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia this week involving Sergei Lavrov of Russia and Marco Rubio of the United States and their underlings. So what is the point of Keith Kellogg right now if he doesn't speak for Donald Trump? If Trump is siding with the Kremlin, Kellogg is siding with Kyiv.
So this is what I keep on saying, that Keith Kellogg, his role is the Russia-Ukraine envoy. This should be his time to shine. He should be non-stop in negotiations, and this should be about him.
Yeah.
But the fact that Trump clearly has decided to favour Russia, I guess, he doesn't want to hear what Keith Kellogg has to say, so he's been sidelined.
We never quite know if with Trump this is a negotiating tactic or not, because on the wake of those quite remarkably undiplomatic remarks about Zelenskyy, we're now hearing that the talks that Zelenskyy effectively ended about Ukraine possibly giving America mineral leases in the east of the country for rare earth minerals that has just, got the dollar signs flashing in Trump's eyes. Those negotiations are now back on. So once again, it's of the fire and fury thing. Is Trump just running off at the mouth, being reckless, irresponsible, maybe pro-Kremlin, or is he actually getting a better deal for the American people?
Look, I've been saying this all along, that Trump's rhetoric about Ukraine and Zelenskyy in the last week is entirely about those mineral resources. They were getting along swimmingly 2 weeks ago when it looked like they were about to do a deal for those rare earth minerals, and then Trump got greedy. He got greedy. He asked for $500 billion worth of rights, which is a lot more than they put into Ukraine. But in particular, he asked for that without giving anything up, without giving up any security guarantees. Yep. And clearly, Zelenskyy was happy to do a deal because he thought he was buying security guarantees because he doesn't trust Europe to protect them. And I don't blame him for not trusting Europe to protect them.
Yeah.
And then when Trump said, no, you're giving me $500 billion for nothing, Zelenskyy just said, sod off. And that is what sent Trump spinning in this path he's going down. So I'm not surprised they keep coming back to those mineral resources. Maybe Keith Kellogg, since he is pro-Ukrainian, might be able to extract a decent deal out of Zelenskyy that Trump can respect. And if he does, then Trump will be all sweetness and light again. You watch.
Yeah, although the paradox for Zelenskyy, of course, is no matter how good a deal he offers Trump right now, if there is going to be an election before this is all finalised, there's every chance that whoever wins that election, if it's not Zelenskyy, then it could be somebody who either offers Trump more or offers Putin more, maybe both.
Could be. I just want to add one thing before we move on, though, and that is when we were talking about Trump accusing Zelenskyy of starting the war, which was a very strange thing to imply. He implied it, he didn't say it. He also, there's something else that he said, which I think hasn't been commented enough on, which is he said, you could have done a deal early, but you didn't. Right? What he was referring to there, which I don't think has been explained enough, is he explained to the rumour that Boris Johnson talked Zelenskyy out of a peace deal with Russia back in April 2022. That was the rumour at the time, that they were just about to sign an agreement, and then Boris Johnson came in and said, don't do that. Now, I just want to say Zelenskyy has completely denied that. He explicitly addressed it at the press conference about a week ago and said that is just not the case, that Putin was making all kinds of ultimatums that I just didn't think I could in good faith agree with. It would betray the Ukrainian people. So I was never going to agree to those terms, even before Boris Johnson showed up, and he didn't say anything like that anyway. So now you might think Zelensky's lying, but I just want you to realise that is what Trump's referring to, I'm sure, and that is what the MAGA people talk about all the time, and Zelenskyy just flat out denies it.
Interesting. With so much attention this week on Trump's unorthodox diplomacy and Elon Musk's very undiplomatic approach to government downsizing, one of the president's major concerns, that of illegal immigration, has kind of slipped from the headlines. Not through lack of trying, though. Trump has issued executive orders seeking to try and strip away everything from birthright citizenship to federal funding for migrant services. He, of course, declared an emergency on the southern border. He described people associated with drug cartels as terrorists and their arrival in the United States as an invasion. Well, Trump's newly confirmed Secretary for Homeland Security, the former South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, unveiled a new multi-million-dollar ad campaign this week, sounds a bit wasteful, warning illegal aliens to leave our country now or face deportation and the inability to return to the United States.
I'm Kristi Noem, the United States Secretary of Homeland Security. Thank you, President Donald J. Trump, for securing our border and putting America first. Let me deliver a message from President Trump to the world. If you are considering entering America illegally, don't even think about it. Let me be clear. If you come to our country and you break our laws, we will hunt you down. Criminals are not welcome in the United States.
Not welcome unless, of course, they are President of the United States already.
Hello, Doge. I'd like to make a report. Sorry, you go on, John.
Get one of those 19-year-olds over, quick, smart. One of the weirdest things, though, that I've seen this week, Chaz, was an ASMR video put out by the White House itself. Now, for the uninitiated, ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. It's not well understood by science, despite the sciencey sounding name. It's often the result, apparently, of soft noises that can cause a bit of a tingle in the back of your head and spine. I guess it's a bit like when somebody whispers in your ear and it sort of tickles a little bit. Anyway, it's all very popular on YouTube videos. So somebody in the White House this week decided it would be clever or funny or something to make an ASMR video out of the deportation process. Now, turning something as serious as the forced deportation in chains of human beings, many of them fearing for their safety or at least their ability to earn an income for themselves and their family, and turning that into something that gives people tingles is, to me, Chaz, pretty sick. It fetishises human misery, but that is where we are with this White House.
Yeah, I guess the Trump administration would say, they're all gang members and murderers and rapists, who cares? That would be the logic, I guess.
They might say that.
Someone in the White House's social media team certainly has a unique sense of humour either way, John, because this was their Valentine's Day message for Twitter. Roses are red, violets are blue, come here illegally and we'll deport you. Look, I kind of understand why they're leaning into this topic. The president's handling of immigration to date is incredibly popular. It's easily his most trusted issue. According to Pew, 59% of Americans approve of Trump's efforts to deport people living in America illegally, and 58% approve of sending additional military forces to the border. And also, I totally get why America is on board. Look at the numbers. After 3 years of over 5,000 apprehended border crossers per day, Biden did his very best last year in an election year to cut the numbers down. He averaged just under 3,000 apprehensions per day. Now, in February so far, Trump is averaging 360 per day. In fact, there was one day this week where there were only 229 immigrants apprehended on the entire southern border. So Americans would be pretty happy with that. MAGA, they'd be over the moon. Unfortunately, though, when you look under the bonnet, the same old issues that have plagued immigration enforcement for the last 20 years, they've not gone away. Like, for instance, number one, as much as Trump liked to pretend last year that there were endless criminal migrants on the loose.
That's over 647,572 migrant criminals who Kamala set loose to rape, pillage, thieve, plunder, and kill the people of the United States of America. And they're not going to change. They're only going to get worse.
I still cannot believe that clip. And there's other crap, by the way. That was the number of illegal immigrants throughout history who have ever committed a crime. And more of them came under Trump than under Biden, by the way. Most of them are in jail as well, okay? So the whole, they're all rapists and murderers or whatever, let's do ASMR, not true. But anyway, if you're going to arrest a lot of migrants, they're not all going to be killers and rapists and pillagers. Most of them are going to just be regular people living their lives, the good kind of illegal immigrant. Most days, it seems that about half of the arrestees have some kind of criminal record, which means the other half are non-violent offenders who have not committed any criminal offence at all other than crossing the border illegally. It's not so popular deporting those people. The second persistent issue is if you arrest lots of people, there's nowhere to put them. ICE only has funding for 41,500 beds in detention. Full stop. So it only took 8,000 arrests by the new administration before they already had to release 461 illegal immigrants back into the community. They didn't want to do that. but they were out of room. Trump used to call that catch and release. Now, he's the one doing it. And finally, the number 3 major persistent issue for the past 20 years has been deporting people is not easy. It takes days and weeks, sometimes months, to complete all the paperwork and legal processes to deport someone, and that is assuming they've already been through the court system. If they haven't, then they join the back of the queue with a 3.5 million case backlog. It could take years to deport people who join that queue. So, where are you gonna put them all? ICE is planning to build 10 new regular detention centres and 4 new supersized detention centres to put them in, but that's going to take ages. In the meantime, where are they going to go? Enter some unorthodox proposals, like for instance stashing about 300 deportees from various countries in a Panama hotel. Is that legal? I got no idea. How about paying to jail convicted migrant criminals and also American citizen criminals in an El Salvador mega prison? I don't think that anyone thinks that's legal. Even Trump seems to have doubts that that would be legal. But the main plan right now seems to be to send arrestees to Guantanamo Bay, where for the last 25 years America has kept its unwanted terror detainees. These days there are only about 15 detainees there, but that leaves plenty of room for migrants to be sent there instead. The administration reportedly intends to increase the capacity of Gitmo from 120 people to 30,000 people. And while keeping detainees there is super expensive and the conditions are considered horrific, don't worry, because the only people going to be sent there are going to be
The worst of the worst.
The worst of the worst?
Well, that's the talking point, except the New York Times already found one new Gitmo resident who they believe is not a gang member or a criminal, but was suspected of being so simply because he has a tattoo of Michael Jordan. He was then interviewed by officials who reportedly did not believe he actually had any ties to a gang, but somehow he ended up in Gitmo anyway. And then, John, there is the question of whether any of this is legal. There is very specific legal authority for the military detainees to be in Gitmo. That was the 2001 authorisation for the use of military force after 9/11, but that doesn't cover any of these migrants. So there's a real question mark over the legality of this entire operation, and yet there is a new flight to Gitmo every single day.
So many question marks. Let's lawyer up. Joining us now is Harold Hongju Koh. He's had a very long and distinguished career in government and academia. He's Professor of Law at Yale University, a former legal advisor to the US State Department, as well as being Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. Professor Koh, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us what concerns you most about these immigration detainees now being sent to and held at Guantanamo Bay?
Well, I think it's illegal. I think it's inhumane, and I think it's unsustainable. All 3 of these are reasons to be concerned, but I think it just further increases our isolation in the world. I think if the United States wants to hold migrants on an offshore island, there's no reason why Putin shouldn't do the same and Xi Jinping shouldn't do the same.
Let's start with the legal. The administration has said that Clinton kept 45,000 Haitians and Cubans on Gitmo in the mid-90s. So, was that legal then? And if so, why isn't it legal now?
Well, we challenged that in court. It was upheld, but some of those Haitians were brought into the United States in response to the lawsuit that we brought in the 90s. So I wouldn't be citing that as a model of legality. But more fundamentally, up until 2 weeks ago, the United States never moved people who were already in the United States onto Guantanamo. The people who were stopped were all coming from somewhere else, were blocked on the high seas and brought there so they would not reach the mainland. And so they were being held pursuant to a different exclusion authority of the immigration laws. That has been challenged in court. It went up through several different iterations. The court finally upheld their right to exclude. But no court has ever held that you can remove someone who's already been to the United States and acquired certain rights, especially if you have not proven that they're committed crimes and are therefore removable.
Professor, during the war on terror, there were some inmates held at Guantanamo Bay without being charged for in excess of 20 years, but that was under laws specifically passed in the wake of 9/11. President Trump has described this as an invasion and drug cartels as terrorists. So does that provide legal justification enough?
No, I mean, he plays with words, but it obviously doesn't affect the legal situation. These people are already inside the United States. They're subject to removal proceedings. The real question is, why aren't they getting more immigration judges to hear those proceedings on a case-by-case basis? Instead, they're reopening a facility which was down to 15 people after all these years, under a different legal authority. Nobody's claiming that these people committed crimes against the United States on September 11th. And that's the basis of the congressional authority on which the people in the Al-Qaeda part of Guantanamo are being held.
Do we know yet where these migrants are being kept? Is it in the same area as the Gitmo prisoners, or is it in the Migrant Operations Center, or is it in tents? Because I've heard all three.
Yeah, they change the story every day. Guantanamo is a bay. You land on the left side, the leeward side is where the main airstrip is. A little bit north of there is a building, which is called the Migrant Operations Center. It used to only hold about 20 people, and then they built it out, so it now holds about 110 people. You cross the bay, which takes about 10 minutes, and then suddenly there's a little village that has a McDonald's and a shopping center, etc. And then there are a series of tent cities in camps that are located behind barbed wire. But finally, they built out one called Camp 6 as a maximum security prison to hold the Al-Qaeda prisoners. Apparently, they have some people in the left side, Migrant Operations Center, but they've also moved people into the maximum security prisoner alongside of people who they think are mass murderers. And they haven't explained who these people are or on what basis they're holding them.
Professor, we have been hearing reports this week that military guards are the ones who are keeping an eye on these new immigration detainees rather than civilian immigration officers. Is that significant?
Yeah, it's just practically significant. These soldiers signed up to be soldiers, not to be prison guards. The base on Guantanamo has always been a joint operations center, which means you have a mixed force. It includes the Coast Guard, Homeland Security, some humanitarian people, but now they're people from the Bureau of Prisons. And the basic security is provided by military guards who rotate on and off, every 3 to 6 months. So they all have to be trained anew, and everybody has to learn everything over and over again. And as a result, they keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
Professor, there's also been reports of confusion over whether the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Defense is in charge of these migrants. Do you have a legal view about that?
There's a lawsuit that's been filed already to get access to the prisoners, relying on a lawsuit that we brought in 1992, which got legal access to the prisoners. So we'll have a better sense of who these people are. We'll have a sense of whether they actually committed any crimes or whether they're just being profiled and brought in as a group. But I think it's pretty simple to just focus it on it this way. Because they're not Al-Qaeda, they're not being held under military authority. Because they've entered the United States, they're not being held on the grounds that they could be excluded from ever entering. And because they're being held outside the United States, they're not being held under immigration detention removal authority. So in other words, they're being held without any legal claim. And that's what the lawsuits will establish. I think when the courts end up holding there's no legal basis to hold them, they will simply stop bringing people there. And I hope that happens sooner rather than later.
There are also undocumented migrants that are being deported from the United States to places like Panama. We hear first to hotels, but then being sent out to camps in the jungle. Is it the case the US can basically send these people to any place that will take them?
It's not clear that they're being accepted. I think that their planes are landing and people are being dumped out. That's not the way that a civilized country behaves, not to mention one that believes in the rule of law. The 1951 UN Refugee Convention made clear that anyone fleeing from persecution and who can establish an individualized, well-founded fear of persecution has a right to claim asylum. And they have a right not to be returned to the place they're fleeing from. And I think both of those are being violated. And I think for your viewers, it's important to understand it is a core principle of U.S. immigration law that we do not administer punishment by group stereotype. The fact that you're Venezuelan and have a tattoo is not a reason to be lumped in and treated as if you're a member of a drug cartel. In this country, we are supposed to judge people by the content of their individual character as proven to an immigration judge in a hearing that takes place with the protections of U.S. law. And to the extent to which they're trying to avoid those rules, which they cannot because those rights have already attached, they're acting in blatantly illegal fashion.
Can I presume then that El Salvador's offer to take migrants into their mega prisons would also be illegal?
Well, we don't know what the scope of that is or what kind of quid pro quo is being requested. To do that, El Salvador would have to give assurances. I used to be the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights at the State Department. You don't send people to these countries without getting a ironclad assurance that they will not subject them to persecution. So transfers can be held up for years because of the failure to get those assurances. The speed and volume with which this is happening suggests that that's not taking place. So what's going on is a chaotic situation. Your viewers should have no illusion. What's going on is entirely chaotic. It's entirely shambolic. It's being made up as they go along, and then they make up justifications after they do things. And the people who suffer are the people who are being transported and dumped into places where they could be persecuted because of who they are.
Professor, recently the president of El Salvador offered to not just take undocumented migrants from the United States, but to take American citizens who have been imprisoned for criminality in the United States, to transport them to El Salvador. What did you make of that?
Well, as you know, in Australia, we have a process by which we transfer prisoners from one place to another. It's called extradition. There are treaties that handle those, and those extradition hearings are conducted again on an individualized basis. And the person has a right to a lawyer in which they can argue that there is no basis for extradition. So the fact that this administration may find willing collaborators doesn't make it legal on either side.
Professor Harold Koh, thank you for being with us on Planet America.
My pleasure.
This was 5 years ago this week.
The president spent most of his press conference repeatedly downplaying the threat of coronavirus, suggesting it's very much the same as the flu, even though its mortality rate is much, much higher.
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. It probably will. It possibly will. It could be at a very small level or it could be at a larger level. Whatever happens, we're totally prepared. We have the best people in the world.
Whatever happened, of course, was 1.2 million Americans would die in the COVID pandemic. And now we could be seeing the start of the next pandemic, H5N1, avian influenza or bird flu.
Let me be clear, there is no immediate public health threat.
The CDC has linked 67 human cases and 1 death to the virus since 2024, but the spread among animals have led to growing concerns among consumers.
It is an issue. At least 875 herds of cattle across 16 states have tested positive to bird flu now, killing roughly 2 to 5% of infected cows and reducing their milk production by about 20%. The Department of Agriculture has already spent more than $2.1 billion, both compensating farmers and trying to control the spread of bird flu. And federal agencies have also spent $292 million developing and stockpiling a vaccine should it be necessary. But so far, the CDC is advising against offering the vaccine to farm workers. They're probably a little bit nervous about how the internet would react to another vaccine.
Yeah, very possibly. So far, there is no evidence of human-to-human transmission. The disease that began with birds has now spread to a range of other animals, including those in the human food chain, like beef and dairy cattle. So, is this an early warning for us all collectively to get prepared, or are we at risk of jumping at shadows? Are the traumatic memories of COVID going to trigger a collective panic 5 years on? Well, for more, we're joined by Dr. Jennifer Nuzzo. She's the Professor of Epidemiology and Director of the Pandemic Centre at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Professor, for many Americans, I suppose right now, bird flu just means $2 eggs at the supermarket. Others believe that it's all a hoax to push up inflation and damage Donald Trump. What would you say now, based on the evidence, is the appropriate level of concern about bird flu?
So I think for most Americans, the concern shouldn't be high. Obviously, the high egg prices is quite alarming. I think the potential impacts on our economy is quite alarming. But as a health threat, unless you're someone who works with animals who are likely to be infected, the threat is not high. As for a conspiracy, I mean, it would have to be a very long conspiracy because we've been tracking this virus for more than 25 years, and it has long been a concern. The level of activity we're seeing in the United States right now is quite unprecedented in terms of our history with H5N1. But this is a virus that's been around for a while, and it's a virus that has long posed risks to agricultural interests.
Dr. Cattle have been experiencing bird flu now for nearly a year, and yet it's only spreading further, at least amongst cattle. So who dropped the ball to let this get out of hand, at least amongst farm animals? The feds or particular states or someone else?
H5N1 is a particularly challenging virus to try to control because it is now being carried by a lot of different animals. Over the last couple of years, we've really seen the virus expand in terms of its geography, now seeing it turn up in countries that didn't before have a lot of H5N1 activity. But we've also seen it expand in terms of the number of animal species it's been able to infect. And finding it in cows was indeed a surprise. But in terms of controlling the virus in the US, this has been a sort of a multi-pronged failure, I would say. The ag side, it's been sort of a bit sluggish in terms of recognizing the threat that H5N1 poses to not just dairy cows, but also poultry and other farm animals. But also on the public health side, I mean, there's been kind of an underreaction to the infections that we have seen in farm workers, in part because most of those infections have been mild, fortunately. But what we know about this virus is that it is not necessarily a mild virus. In fact, it has historically been one of the most deadly. And so I think there's just been a real sluggishness to react to this virus with the urgency that it deserves, probably in part because 5 years after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, people are tired. And I think maybe there was this hope that somehow this virus would just disappear. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
Now, you said the virus has been mild, but it can be severe. So from what you've seen so far from the humans who have contracted bird flu, how does it compare in severity to, say, COVID?
So historically, H5N1 has been one of the more deadly viruses that we have observed. About 900 or so cases have occurred globally to date over the several decades of tracking this virus. So again, a small number, but about half of those have died. Now, in recent years, there have been fewer deaths, and nobody quite understands why that might be. In the US, the majority of cases that have occurred, and again, these are mostly in people who have worked with sick animals, so people who have worked with infected cattle or people who have worked with infected poultry. These recent cases have had mild symptoms, meaning they haven't wound up in the hospital, they haven't died. We have, though, seen very recently some severe illnesses. There was a teenager in Canada, British Columbia, that was hospitalized for a very long time. A person died in Louisiana. And over this past weekend, there were 2 additional hospitalizations associated, or reports of hospitalizations associated with H5N1. So we don't know why some people get severe illness and why some people experience mild infection. There have been a lot of hypotheses, but these are just guesses at this point. But the fact that we have had this historic observation of a very high case fatality ratio, the percentage of people who have gotten sick, who have died, has been quite high. I think that makes us quite worried. We also know that when animals, and in epidemiology and in virology, ferrets are considered a bit of a proxy for what could happen to humans if they were infected. When these animals are exposed, they get quite ill with this virus and they die. So this, as what we're currently seeing, has this virus to be far more lethal than what we ever observed with COVID-19. And for that reason, people are quite worried.
Dr. Nuzzo, the US federal government is undergoing a lot of very disruptive changes at the moment, including at the Department of Agriculture itself. The United States is also withdrawing from international bodies such as the World Health Organization. What impact is all of that having on preparations and response to bird flu?
My top concern today is that this upheaval is, first of all, multiple. One, we are seeing a real restructuring of federal agencies. Many federal workers are being laid off. Policies around personnel are being issued, and it's been caused a lot of uncertainty and chaos. And the attention of federal agencies has had to shift in order to deal with this kind of almost daily incoming on the personnel front. So that, I think, is challenging. We have also seen what has really been sort of unprecedented freeze in communications from federal health agencies. So for weeks now, federal health agencies have not been able to speak with what they call external partners. That's everyone from the WHO to our state and local health officials to the American public and clinicians. The way that our federal health agencies have been able to communicate has been dampened, so to speak. There have been multiple instances of this, and this is important because communication is probably the most important tool we have in order to respond to infectious disease threats like H5N1. So what the impacts are, I think it's a little bit too early to tell, but we have a lot of reasons to be concerned. I'll give you one very specific example of something I'm worried about. Our U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have something called the MMWR. It's a sort of scientific journal, sort of a rapidly published scientific journal. It's a way that CDC uses to relay data that have been reviewed by other scientists, and it's accompanied with an analysis, and it gets published, and it's sent to health departments and clinicians and the public and the media. It helps everybody understand what's going on from a very scientific basis. It's an in-depth publication. It's not just like writing words on a website. It is a scientific article. The MMWR has been published reliably every single week since it was established in 1960. But the MMWR stopped being published at the start of the Trump administration. Now it's back. It's being published again on a weekly basis. But we know that there have been some H5N1 specific reports that have been withheld. And we don't know exactly why they've been withheld, but they have been withheld. And that is concerning because if there's new evidence about H5N1, evidence that's critical for us to understand the risks that this virus poses and what to be done about it, then those papers need to be published urgently.
Now, Doctor, my understanding is a vaccine already exists for bird flu, but it isn't being offered to farm workers. Can you talk us through what's going on there?
So the United States has long been worried about the potential for a flu pandemic to occur and has been preparing for a flu pandemic really since the Bush administration. And as a result, has worked to develop and stockpile H5N1 vaccines. Now, these aren't ready to be used in the general public, and they probably won't be used in the general public, but there are vaccines available that could be prepared to be offered to our agricultural workers. That's something that I and other scientists have been arguing should be done. Some other countries have chosen to protect their agricultural workers from H5N1 by offering vaccines. And I think the United States, given the fact that our farm workers continue to be affected by this virus, should be offered H5N1 vaccines. What it means that the U.S. has developed H5N1 vaccines is that we have these vaccines available. We don't know if these are the vaccines that we would need if H5N1 became a pandemic virus, because, again, right now it is not good at infecting people, and it is not good at people can't transmit the virus very easily. To gain those abilities, it would have to change in some way, and we don't know if those changes would mean that the vaccines that we have would be effective. But what I think it does mean is that we are better prepared for a flu pandemic, generally speaking, because of all of this prior preparedness than we were for COVID-19, which at the beginning there was, no one had any idea if we would ever have a vaccine for COVID. And I'm very glad that after a year we were able to develop multiple safe and effective vaccines. But that was a much different scenario than what we are dealing with H5N1. But I have to stress, because, there are general political moments around vaccines in the US and as in other countries, that I don't anticipate that these vaccines would be used in the general public, absent a pandemic, which is not what we're dealing with right now.
Professor Jennifer Nuzzo, thank you for being with us on Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
Before we go, Republican Senator Mitch McConnell of the great state of Kentucky has formally announced he will not seek another term in the Senate next year. At the age of 83, after 40 years spent in the United States Senate, McConnell is the longest-serving Senate party leader in American history. And it was Mitch McConnell who famously declared in 2010 that for Republicans at the time, the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. That was very controversial at the time. It was both a statement of reality at a time when they wanted to repeal Obamacare. It was also, though, seen as a highly partisan obstructionist statement when historically the Senate was seen as a cooling saucer for democracy, one that would work with the president of either party to get things done, not to simply try and thwart their agenda and then defeat them at the next election. During the Trump years, Mitch McConnell worked with the president on some conservative priorities like tax cuts. He was unable, though, to do what they'd all been talking about for years, repeal and replace Obamacare. But also, Mitch didn't really conceal his disdain for Donald Trump at certain times. And you also got the feeling, Chaz, that, well, the feeling was entirely mutual from Donald Trump. Yeah. Yet ever the pragmatist, Mitch McConnell, despite his criticisms of Trump, particularly after Trump denied that he'd lost the 2020 election and helped to incite an insurrection on January 6th, Mitch McConnell, well, went from looking to possibly impeach the guy to endorsing him to become president again last year. So with all of that, the man in full, Mitch McConnell, what do you think his legacy should be?
Okay, three things. Number one, he spearheaded the increasing partisanship of the Senate. Mm-hmm. He had a lot of help from Democrats at the time, but he was definitely at
He used the filibuster in a way that nobody had done before.
Exactly, and then he pushed the Democrats into pushing it even further. And then the second thing was he pushed the Supreme Court nomination process into a more partisan place than it had ever been before when he refused to give Merrick Garland even a hearing.
After Antonin Scalia died in an election year.
Yep, and therefore handing the Republicans an extra seat on the Supreme Court.
And possibly handing Trump the presidency because a lot of Republicans looked at Trump and said, we don't like him, but we definitely want a conservative Supreme Court.
Yep, which may have ramifications for 20 or 30 years from now. And thirdly, despite the fact he hated Donald Trump and Donald Trump hated him, I think you have to say his legacy is when the second impeachment came after January 6th, when Republicans genuinely were about to throw Trump on his ear, Mitch McConnell put as much sand in the gears of that impeachment as he possibly could. And in the end, he convinced and gave permission for Republicans to vote no on the removal of Donald Trump. And if it had been a different Senate leader at that point in time, Republican leader at that point in time, then maybe Donald Trump would have been removed and there never would have been a second term of Donald Trump, for better or for worse. You can decide. But either way, I think Mitch McConnell is as responsible for that as anyone.
Yes, well, I suppose Mitch can ponder all of that as he sits under his fig tree and vine. That's it for this weekend edition of Planet America. We'll have an all-new show for you next Wednesday night on ABC TV at about 9:40, and anytime you like from 9 on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
And we're going to be back right here on ABC News at the same time next week as well. We'll see you there.
Bye.